Here we go. Okay. By the way, I at this wedding that I'm in, I met the founder of All Daf app. You know, he's a friend of my brother-in-law's, and I told him about little share. He was very interested about our share that we can post it online with the picture of the daf. He was very intrigued with that. So he's head of the OU, but his division is to run that All Daf app. So I know him well. If you never wanted to meet him, cute guy. Anyway, we're up to Daf Memtes Summit. Memtes, we're going to just start a very interesting Daf. I think from all the Dafim that we ever learned, this is going to be quite interesting once we finish the last topic that we learned. So we're going to start from Memches Summit Base, and it's about like 7-8 lines from the bottom. Tana, we learned in a brisa. Masar av l'shluchei habal. We're discussing when a woman is engaged, and the father gave her over to the messengers of the husband. Now, remember, a nara hamurasa, a girl that's 12 years old that's engaged, if she would do znus, right, she gets skila. That we know. But once the father gave her over to the messengers of the husband, so she has a din. Her din is like she's married. So harezu bechenek. If she would commit adultery, her death would be choking, not the stoning. So the Gemara says, how would I know such a thing? The truth is that if it was no chuppah over there, it should have a din of skila. So the Gemara says, Amar Abami, Amar Chama, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, by Hanara Hamurasa. If she does nus, she gets skila, because the pasuk says, Liznoi space avia, if she did the adultery in her father's house. Prop, this excludes L'shemasa av l'shluchabal. Once the father gave her over to the messengers of the husband, once the father gave her over to the messengers of the Baal, of the husband, so he waved goodbye to his daughter. So it's almost like it's a quasi-marriage, like she's on the way to get married. So then her misa, if she commits adultery, is not skila, but chenek. So the Gemara says, Ve'ema, let us say, prat, maybe this pasuk liznoi space avia means to exclude shenichnasa lechuppah v'loy nivala. That means in a case that she went to chuppah and she didn't have relations, then she gets skila, she gets a chenek because she actually went to the chuppah. Let us say that if it was just the father giving her over to the messengers of the husband, she still has a din of a nara hamarasa and she gets skila. And what is listener space avia coming to exclude? That means that if she went to chuppah already, even though they didn't have relations with the husband, her misa for adultery would be chenek. So the Gemara says that I wouldn't say because Amar Rava, Amali Ami, Ami told me chuppah behed yiksiv. The Torah says as soon as she goes into a chuppah, then she gets chenek. That's already, we don't need this pasuk listener space avia. Why? Because the pasuk says like this. We learned these psukim. Kiyu nara basula ma'irasal ish. If you find a 12-year-old girl who's a virgin, ma'irasal ish, she's engaged to a man and she did adultery, she gets skila. Nara, so we darshan nara. If she's 12 years old, loy begeres. It does excluding an adult. If she's adult, then she doesn't get. It's only for a nara, 12-year-old girl that did this. Basula, if she's a virgin, v'loy beula. If she had an affair with somebody before she got engaged, her misa is not the skila. Ma'irasa, she was engaged to the man, v'loy nesua, not married. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? My nesua, if she was married, ilema nesua mama, she's actually married. Haina basula v'loy belul. That's what it means. If you're virgin, didn't have relations with anybody, and the fact that she had relations with her husband, she's a regular ish who gets chenek, not skila. Elalav. So must be that this pasuk is trying to say that she went into chuppah and she didn't have bia yet, and therefore her misa would be chenek. So then I know that gets chenek from that pasuk. So liznois beisavia is coming to add something even more. That means that even if they didn't go to chuppah yet, but the father just waved goodbye to her and gave her to the messengers of the husband, she's considered like a married woman, and therefore her misa for adultery would be chenek. We go to the next page. Hold on. Hold on. Okay, we go to the top of Mem Tes Samad Aleph. So now the Gemara says, now the Gemara asks the question, what happens, the email, what would be the scenario? A new Gemara. Let's say she ran away from the messengers of the husband, went back home. Would you say that would be like she went back to her father's jurisdiction? Would you say that? Let's say she turned around and went back home. Amar Rava said, that we already learned from Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. The Brisa, the Tana Rabbi Shmuel, the Neida Almana Grusha Koil Asha Asra Al Nafsha Yakum Aleha. So the Torah says that a woman who became a widow, or she's divorced, she's an independent woman. Let's say her father married her off, she got married, and then her husband died, or her husband divorced her. So then the Pasuk says that any vow she makes, she has jurisdiction over. In other words, her father cannot nullify it. It's not, she's in her own independent woman, even if she's just 12 years old. So the Pasuk says, Ma Tam Elohim. The Gemara asks the question, the Bryce asks, what does the Pasuk teach me? Of course, as if she got married already, she already left the father because her father married her off as a 12-year-old. And she already left the husband because her husband died or divorced her. Certainly, her vows, she takes responsibility for her vows, and her father cannot nullify them. Ella, what does the pasuk teaches you? If the father didn't give her over to marriage, but as soon as he waved goodbye to her and said, "You're going with the messengers of the husband," or let's say she went with the messengers of the father, and the messengers of the father gave her over to the messengers of the husband, and then on the way to go to her husband's city to get ready for the marriage, she got news that her husband died or she got divorced. Hey, what would I think about her? Is she the father? Is she in her father's jurisdiction or her husband's jurisdiction? Right now, she's going to go back to her father's house. She never really got married. He teaches you, as soon as she left 1 hour from the father's jurisdiction, that's it. He has no power over her to nullify her vows. So even if she didn't go to chuppah, as soon as he waved goodbye and said, "Okay, go with the messengers of the husband," like in Yitzchak, Rivka went with the messenger of Avram Avinu, Eliezer. So as soon as they waved goodbye to her, they don't have any jurisdiction over her, and therefore he cannot make for the vows. So that's it. You can't go back. You can't return back to your father's house. Amar Papa said, "Af anan name tenina." We have a brisa that agrees with that. Haboa al nara amarasa, someone who has relations with a nara hamarasa. That means a woman, a girl, 12-year-old girl that's engaged. Ein nechayev. He's not. He doesn't get punished. Achete nara. He doesn't get skila. Achete nara besula ma'irasa. She has to be a 12-year-old girl, a virgin, and she has to be engaged. He severe, and she's in her father's house. So what is the Brisa teaching you? That's when he gets skila, because normally he gets chenek. Adult relationship with a woman, right? An ish relationship gets chenek. He would get skila. So you have to have all these conditions. Bishlama, it makes perfect sense. Nara, if she's a 12-year-old girl, that's excluding the begerish, not an adult. Bisula, she was a virgin, that excludes if she had an affair with prior to getting engaged, that he wouldn't get skila. That fact that he's engaged excludes that if he was not married, if she was not yet married, then she gets skila. The Vesavir, she's still in her father's house. What does that mean? Lamute mai. What is that excluding? Lav, doesn't it mean if the father gave her over to the messengers of the husband, then again, the point is that the misa changes. The death changes from skila to chenek. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, there's a brisa that says, a mishnah that says that. Habo al eshes ish, someone who has relations with a married woman. As soon as this married woman went to the chuppah, even though she didn't have relations with her husband, someone who has relations with her, then his misa is chenek, which means choking. So Niknasa Lershus Baal Baalma, as soon as she goes into the husband's jurisdiction, that's what it means. Shmamina, shmamina, that's what it means. That it means that that means that as soon as the husband, as soon as she goes into the husband's jurisdiction, that's when the misa changes from skila to cherek. Shmamina, this is a perfect proof. Okay, so we just learned something new, that if as soon as the father says goodbye to his daughter, his engaged daughter, so then the misa changes. Whoever has an adulterous relationship with her, the misa changes from skila to cherek. Okay, new Mishnah, and this is what makes this daf very interesting. Ha'av, a father, a father is not obligated to feed his daughter. In other words, up until 6 years old, Chachamim said you have to feed your children. You can't just walk away from your responsibility. Once they turn 6 years old, it's you're not obligated to feed your children. It's a mitzvah to provide for them food, but you're not obligated. And the Mishnah only says that you're not obligated in the food for your daughter. Zeh midrash Dorosh Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah lifnei Chachamim. This speech Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah made for the Chachamim, the Kerem B'Yavna, when the Sanhedrin was in Kerem B'Yavna. Okay, it's called this place called Kerem B'Yavna, and it's called Kerem because everybody sat in rows like a vineyard. But anyway, he made a speech there, Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. In his first speech, he said, "Habonim yirshu, v'habonis yizoinu." Very interesting. When a man dies, his sons inherit all his possessions. V'habonis, but his daughters yizoinu get fed from it until they get married. Ma habonim, just like sons, einin yorshin ela acha misasav, just like a son doesn't inherit until after his father died. Af habonis einin izonis, there's no obligation to feed your daughter ela acha misas aviyah until after the father dies. Fascinating point. The point is that when a father is alive, and you got to think about this, I'm not sure, but when the father is alive, he's not obligated to provide for his children food. It's not an obligation. It's a mitzvah, but it's not an obligation. When he dies, so one of the conditions of the kesuba is that the children would inherit, and his daughters have a right for food, and they're obligated to take food from his estate. And that is part of the ksuba. So the obligation to feed your daughters begins only after a person dies. While he's alive, it's all just a mitzvah. So let's go into the Gemara. First, the Gemara says like this: "B'mzoinas bitay, you're mechayev to feed your daughter. You're not obligated to feed your daughter." So the Gemara wants to make a diuk. Who de'ei nechayev? You're not obligated to feed your daughter. Are you obligated to feed your son? So bite nami, so the Gemara says like this: bite nami chayvahu deleke. There's no obligation to feed your daughter, ha mitzvah ika, but there's an obligation to feed your daughter. There's a mitzvah. It's no obligation, but you get a good deed if you do. Now, again, we're talking about a girl who's over 6 years old. So the Gemara wants to say from the Mishnah, you could imply that a boy who's over 6 years old is an obligation to feed. A girl who's over 6 years old, there's no obligation, but there's a mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Mani Masnisim, then we don't have an author for this Mishnah. Loi Rameir, not like Rameir. Loi Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Yehuda. Loi Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. Why? The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, mitzvah lozen es abonos. There's a mitzvah to, not an obligation, there's a mitzvah to give your daughters food. Kal v'chomer lebanim. Certainly your sons. Why? Why is it kal v'chomer? Certainly your sons. To ask b'Torah, because your children are going to yeshiva, they're learning. Divrei Ameir. So Ameir says, you get a mitzvah after 6 years old, until they're 12 or 13 to give food for your daughters. Certainly your sons, because the sons, of course, they're going to yeshiva. Divrei Ameir. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Mitzvah lozen es abonim. There's a mitzvah to give food to your children, to your sons. The kal v'chomer lebanos, certainly to your daughters, because mishum zelusa, there's a much more a much more implied reason to support your own daughters, because it's embarrassing your 6, 7-year-old daughter. How is she going to provide for herself? She's a girl. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says there's an obligation. There's no obligation, but there's a mitzvah to give for your son and for your daughter. Both Rabbi Meir agree. The only difference between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is who's the most certain. According to Rabbi Meir, certainly you're supposed to give your sons because they're learning Torah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the more obvious one is your daughters, because it's embarrassing for them to start working. How are they going to how are they going to collect money for themselves in order to provide food for themselves? And so the difference between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is, in case if the person only has enough for either his son or his daughter. Let's say a man had died and he has a son and a daughter, and he only has money to supply for his son or for his daughter. So the din is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you give it to the daughter. According to Rabbi Meir, you give it to the son. But both of them agree that there's no obligation. It's just a mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, I love this Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, he says, not only is it not a mitzvah, there's no obligation, there's no chayva, but there's no mitzvah to even give. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika says, chayva losin es abonos la'achar misas aviv. The only time you're obligated to give your daughters is after the death of the father. Aval b'chaye avicha, and when the father is alive, elu ve'elu einin uzayin. There's no mitzvah to give your own children. Let them get a job. So the Gemara says like this: Mani masnizin. Who is our Mishnah like? Rab Meir ha'amen b'ana mitzvah. Who said your son is a mitzvah, not an obligation? It's just a mitzvah. Rabbi Yehuda ha'amen b'ana nami mitzvah. If our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, he also said boys are also a mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, afila mitzvah nami leika. Our Mishnah cannot go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, because even to give your daughter, there's no mitzvah. Certainly, there's no obligation. So the Gemara says to none of your children. So the Gemara says, Iba Yisema Rabbi Meir, Iba Yisema Rabbi Yehuda, Iba Yisema Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. I could learn our Mishnah that the author is Rabbi Meir, or it could be Rabbi Yehuda, or it could be Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. Let us explain. Iba Yisema Rabbi Meir. You can say our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Meir, who said that there's a mitzvah to give your boys, and certainly the girl, and certainly the mitzvah to give the girls, and certainly the boys, because they're Isaac and Torah. This is what the Mishnah says. A father is not obligated to give his food for his daughter. Certainly for not his son. He's not obligated. But there's also a mitzvah to give your daughter. Certainly to your sons. Why does it say is a mitzvah to give your daughter? Because I might think the mitzvah is only to give your son. We turn to Mentes Summit Bays. Why does it say mitzvah to give your son? I would think that there's an obligation to give your daughter because she's embarrassing herself by collecting. There is no obligation to give your daughter. Mitzvah ika, but there is a mitzvah to give your daughter. Again, our Mishnah goes according to a mayor who holds that there's no obligation to give your 6-year-old food. There's only a mitzvah, and for a girl and for a boy. The Iba is saying, I could say Rabbi Yehuda. It goes according to Rabbi Yehuda. And this is what the Brisa means, the Mishnah means to say. A father is not obligated to give food for his daughter. The kolshkein libnoi, certainly for his son. Mitzvah bibnoi ika, but there is a mitzvah to give your son. The kal v'chomer lebanis, and certainly for the daughters because they're being embarrassed collecting. So there's a mitzvah both for the girls, both for the boy, and certainly for the girls. Why does it say you're not obligated to give your daughter? Even your daughter who's being embarrassed by going collecting, there is no obligation. The Iba is saying Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, and you could say our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. And this is what the Mishnah means to say: you're not obligated in your food for your daughter, and not only that, your son. And now, if you're Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, there is no mitzvah either. Not only is no obligation to give your food for your children, there's no mitzvah either. There's no mitzvah at all to support your kids. Let them get a job after 6 years old. But the only time that there would be an obligation to give your children. It's your daughter after you die. And that's because it's written in the Ksuba that if you die, the daughters can take food from the estate. That's the only time there's an obligation. Other than that, there's no obligation according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, and it's not even a mitzvah. Very important. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika holds for a boy, a girl over 6 years old, there is no mitzvah to even, let them eat supper at your table. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda and according to Rabbi Meir, there's a mitzvah to give your children food after 6 years old, but there is no obligation. The only time there's an obligation to give your daughter is after a person dies, and that's part of the ksuba. Now, let's go new Gemara. The Gemara continues. Now, what is the halacha? If you go like a Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, so then everybody will, after 6 years old, they'll tell their children, okay, go get a job. So Omar Rabbi Ilo, Omar Shlokish Mishum, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Chanina, Usha Hiskinu. In Usha, the Sanhedrin made a rule, Sheyehei Adam, a man should zon espanav espanoisav kshen ketanim. A person should give his boys and girls when they're below bar mitzvah. That's what we're talking about, low bar mitzvah. Once they turn bar mitzvah, there's no mitzvah to give them. Of course, nowadays there is, but the real takana was that you're supposed to supply food for them up until they're 12 years old. So the Gemara says that was in Usha. Was the halacha like this, or was the halacha not like this? Do we remain with that? So the answer is yes. Tashma, come in here. When a man came to Rabbi Yehuda, and a guy who's a very cheap guy, and he says, I'm not giving food to my children, they're over 6. Rabbi Yehuda said, this big whale gives birth, and he puts the obligation to feed the pup on the people of the city. So in other words, Rabbi Yehuda was like embarrassing him in public and saying that how could you do such a thing? You gave birth. You're the father of these children. You're obligated to. You should support them. It's the more right thing to do. When they came to Rav Chizda, he said, a guy comes to Rav Chizda and he said, listen, I'm not giving my kids anything after 6 years old. So he said to his gabbai, or to the shliach tzibur, Amalu kafalu asisa b'tzibura, turn over a bowl. In other words, make a stage in the public. The lake in Vilayman, you get up and announce urva by. In other words, Rav Chizda wanted to force him, so you can't force him. If there's an obligation, then Bezdin can give malchus. That's the point. If there was a choiva, then you can force somebody by giving malchus. But if there's no obligation, it's just a mitzvah, how could you force somebody? So Rav Chizda gave an idea, just embarrass him. Make him so embarrassed that he's going to want to give his children. Because that's what Rav Chizda said. This guy that didn't want to support his children, so Rav Chizda told somebody to get on a stand in front of the people, the lake in Velema, and say, Urva Baya B'nai, a raven, which is a cruel type of bird, wants children. Vahu Gavra Loy Baya B'nai, and this child doesn't want children. In other words, the raven, when it has a child, it supports its child. So this man is even crueler than a raven because he's not supporting his child. So the Gemara just asks a side question. Wait a second. But Urva Boya B'nai, do ravens feed their children? We find that the pasuk says, "Vaksiv livnei oyev ashikro." God is so merciful that for a raven, the child of a raven that call out to God, "Help me," because my parents abandoned me. God provides food for them, and somehow through their feces, it turns into worms. They have food. So we see that ravens, once they have children, they abandon them. So how do you say that ravens take care of their children? So the Gemara says, "Loikasha ha b'chivari." When they're born, they're white, so the parents don't recognize them, or they don't want to recognize them, and they abandon them. Ha b'ikome. But when they turn black, the parents recognize the child, and therefore they supply food for the child. So we see that one of the ways. So again, if a guy is not a rich guy, and he decides he doesn't want to, go the extra mile to support his kids, he wants to sit and learn all day. So then we get up and embarrass him in public. But now the Gemara is going to say, what happens if he's a rich guy? When they came to Rava, Amalei, he said to him, and this guy didn't want to support his children. Amalei nichalachtem itazni banecha mitzedakah. You want your kids to just take charity? Below, okay. So I mean, he embarrassed him. Says, "You want your kids to go collecting? Go." He tried to convince them. Go give them. So the Gemara concludes this whole story. Below Amrin, all these things that you embarrass a guy and you try to convince him to support his kids. Eladoloy Amid, if he's not a rich guy. Aval Amid, but if he's a rich guy, then kafina le al korcha, then you give him malchus. If he's a rich guy, you can give him. Why? Because rich people, Besdin has the right to give them malchus to start to, or Besdin could foreclose on some of their properties for tzedakah. If he's able to give tzedakah and he's not giving, in certain instances, Besdin could take over his property and give tzedakah. So kafina le al korchi, we force him against his will. Yehada Rava, kafil or Rav Nosson bar Ami. Rava forced Rav Nosson bar Ami and brought out from him dalet mei zuzei l'tzedakah. He gave 400 zuz for tzedakah. So just like you could force a rich guy, if he's so stingy, you could force it out of him. Bezdin could force out tzedakah from him. So if he's a rich guy and he's deciding not to give his children who are over 6 food, so then Bezdin could force it out of him and foreclose on his property and sell it. The Gemara continues one last piece and we'll stop. Oma Rab Eloi Omer Shlokish. We talked about Usha Hiskinu. In Usha, there was a place where the Sanhedrin made rules. So they gave up a new rule. What's the new rule? HaKoisef kol nechasav lilvanav. A new case. A guy, he for whatever reason writes that all my possessions I want it to my sons. My sons to get it. Why? He wants to maybe qualify for welfare program. So he writes all the assets belongs to his son. So the Gemara says, "Who the boys cannot force his parents to go work. He meant to say that they're obligated now to give him and his wife food." So the Gemara says that seems like obvious. If he's gifting all his kids his assets, the least they can do for them is provide for them food. Maskif lo Rab Zeir v'Teimer Rab Shmuel bar Nachmani. We find Gedolim Zu Amri. Even a greater case, we find that from his assets, food is not included, because the Mishnah says, the Bryce is going to say, Al Manosei Nizainis Minachasa. When a man dies, from his possessions, from his estate, his widow gets the food. Who in this case, when he didn't die, he just gave it over to his children. Certainly, he gets food. That they can't cut him out from and make him starve. The Shalach le Ravin begarte. Ravin sent Misha Mace. A man died. V'hiniach almana ubas, and he left over a widow and a daughter, one daughter. So so who really inherits all his assets? If he had only one daughter and one widow, the daughter really owns the assets. Almanasai nizanis minachasa. The widow is supposed to be fed from his possessions. Nises, but if she gets Nises Abbas, if the daughter gets married, so now the husband of the daughter takes over those possessions. Nevertheless, Almanasai nizanis minachasa. The almana, his mother-in-law, still can take food from the estate, even though it's transferred now. The ownership of the estate is transferred over to the son-in-law. Nevertheless, the almana gets food. Mesa Habas. Let's say the daughter died, and now everything belongs to the son-in-law. There's no daughter here anymore. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Achoisesh Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina. Rabbi Yehuda said, "Al Yodi Hoyei Maisa." I had such a story. V'amru, and I still said, "Almana nizaynis minachasa." His almana still will get fed from his old possessions, because really, it was her obligation. It was his obligation to support his wife after he dies. So even though through a series of steps, his possessions were transferred over to his son-in-law that he never met, and his daughter died, still the almana still is able to take food from the estate. So certainly, certainly and this is the problem. Certainly, if a man gifts his children, they didn't work for any of this money. So certainly, they would have an obligation to support their parents. Why would we need you to teach me such a? Why would I need Rav Shlokish to say in Usha they made this rule that if a man writes all his assets to his children, that they obligated to support them? Answers the Gemara, Mahu the same. I would have thought Hasam who the lake the Tarach, Aval Hacha literally the day Lidida. I over there, since by the case of the son-in-law, right, where there is no daughter, so there's nobody to look after the almana. So there we would say that the husband, the husband or this new son-in-law who took over the assets certainly has to support his mother-in-law. But in this case, where a father writes all his possessions over to his children, I would think that literally the daily dilah. So he now has to go get a job to provide food for his kid, for his wife and him. Kamash Milan. So we say we don't say that. We don't say that. So one last piece. The question was hilchas kavasei, less hilchas kavasei. Is the halacha like this or not? Tashma, the Rab Chanina, Rab Yonason have a kame. They were standing. Rab Chanina and Rab Yonason. Also, who Gavre, Gochen, and Shakel, Rab Yonason Akari. This man came and Rab Yonason bent over and kissed his feet. Very interesting. Amalei Rab Kanina, my high, why are you kissing this man's feet? Amalei, so Rabbi Yonason said to Rab Chanina, the reason why I'm kissing his feet, because Kosev Nechosev Labanafu. He was a man who wrote all his assets belonged to his children. Okay, we go to Memtes, just one line on top. And what happened? And I forced them to uh, I forced them to give him support. Yamr b'shlama lavdine. If that's not the halacha, mishum hacha ashiyine. That's why he had to force them. He had to force them because that's not the halacha. But Eliyam Medina, if that's really the halacha, ashina boya, did he have to force them? So since this guy went ahead and followed what Rabbi Yonason suggested to support his parents, therefore Rabbi Yonason kissed his feet because he did lifnim mishura sadin, and that's why the halach is not like usha. If a man writes over his possessions to his children, they're not obligated to give him mezainis. They're not obligated to give him support. Okay, we will stop right over here.